And what you need to see, what you need to know is that throughout Zechariah, from about chapter 5 on, a emphasis is placed upon enemies of Israel coming against them in different ways. Specifically, Jerusalem now becoming the focal point. In chapter 11, chapter 12, now the focal point is the city of Jerusalem. And so now the affliction of the enemies specifically coming on the city of Jerusalem. And that some things are happening there. So we're going to go now to Zechariah 13. Okay. Zechariah 13. It says that in that day a fountain shall be opened for the house of David. That's the temple. It'll be the temple in Jerusalem. There is no temple in Jerusalem right now. They said in that day a fountain shall be opened for the house of David and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for sin and for uncleanliness. It shall be in that day, says the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they shall no longer be remembered. I will also cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to depart from the land. It shall come to pass that if anyone still prophesies, then his father and mother who begot him will say to him, you shall not live, because you have spoken lies in the name of the Lord. And his father and mother who begot him shall thrust him through when he prophesies. It shall be in that day that every prophet will be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies. They will not wear a robe of coarse hair to deceive. But he will say, I am no prophet, I am a farmer. For a man taught me to keep cattle from my youth. And one will say to him, what are these wounds between your arms? Then he will answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is my companion, says the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. Then I will turn my hand against the little ones. It shall come to pass in all the land, says the Lord, that 2/3 in it shall be cut off and die. But 1/3 shall be left in it, and I will bring the 1/3 through the fire. Will refine them as silver is refined, and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, this is my people. And each one will say, the Lord is my God. In chapter 13 can be very confusing, because once again, it's kind of like chapter 11, chapter 12. It sounds like you're kind of left with saying, you know, who's he talking about? Which side is he talking about? Which side is God on at this point? You know, and obviously God doesn't switch sides. But he's talking about Israel, specifically Jerusalem and the temple. It shall be in that day that I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, and they will no longer be remembered, and I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to depart from the land. Okay? He is talking about cleansing, obviously, the false prophets and the idols that will be there at that time. In the time that Zechariah, about 400 years before Jesus, he's talking about a time that can be compared to the time of Christ. And the Roman Empire, which is there, which celebrates paganism and pagan worship. So there's false idols and stuff like that. But he's talking about a time that is future from our perspective also as well. So verses 1, 2, and 3, you have to realize he's talking about a cleansing period that has to take place in Jerusalem. And he's talking about false prophets and idols being cut off. Verse 4, you need to understand that a switch takes place now when he's speaking. And it shall be in that day that every prophet will be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies. They will not wear a robe of coarse hair to deceive, but he will say to them, I am no prophet, I am a farmer, for a man taught me to keep cattle in my youth. He's talking also, and it's easy to make this confusion, this switch, because he was just talking about false prophets. Now he has switched, and he's talking about during this time, he mentions every prophet. And he's not just talking about false prophets or that. He's talking about every prophet will be ashamed of his vision. Okay? He's talking about the fact that these prophets have these visions of what is taking place, and prophets at that time are going to see the word of the Lord fulfilling in front of them. You all do know that Isaiah, Jeremiah prophesied about the Babylonians overtaking Judah. They did not like to say what they were saying, and as a matter of fact, Isaiah arguably was killed for it. Jeremiah was exiled for it. Okay, so prophets at this time are going to see what's going on, and he's saying that they will be ashamed of their vision when he prophesies, and they will not wear a robe of coarse hair to deceive. And there's a lot to get into on that. And then in verse 6, and one will say to him, what are those wounds between your arms? And then he will answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. When we're talking about wounds between the arms or someplace having to do with the arms or hands, what's it sound like he's talking about? The wounds, the scars. He's talking about the crucifixion, Jesus Christ the Messiah, the gospel. So he's talking about a switch has taken place while the cleansing of Jerusalem is happening, and people are turning toward and asking questions they've never asked before concerning the gospel of the Messiah. Okay? That's what's taking place. There has been a cutoff of false religion and false prophets. Prophets are having a vision, much like Isaiah and Jeremiah, a vision that is they're not proud of. And people are turning to something they've never turned to at this point. And that is they're turning to the gospel of Jesus. Okay, so that's what's going on. And then verse 7, 8, and 9, and he's talking about there's going to be a cutting off. And 2/3 will be cut off. 1/3 he will bring through the fire. He's talking about the tribulation. The tribulation that the time of tribulation that the book of Revelation speaks of is a time when many Jews will be deceived because of a false prophet called the Antichrist. Okay? So Zechariah at least is telling us that in terms of numbers, if you want to look at it that way, a majority will be deceived by the Antichrist. If you read Revelation, you got to understand that means they will be marked by the Antichrist, and only 1/3 will remain. Who are those 1/3? The ones who turned to the prophet, the Messiah, and started asking about these wounds. Tell me this about the wounds, the crucifixion, the gospel, the Messiah, Son of God. Tell me about this. I want to know now. 1/3 he's going to bring through the fire. Okay. Chapter 14, verse 1. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Now, verse 1 and 2, he's talking about people being taken captive from Jerusalem into captivity. He's not speaking about the Babylonian captivity. That's already happened at this point. And Zechariah is prophesying. He's not talking about that. He's talking about something that is going to happen in Jerusalem and a battle for the city which is going to take place. And the city is going to be divided. Okay? In some at some point. Half the city shall go into captivity. I want to say the city is going to be divided, not physically divided like Cold War Berlin. He's talking about the people, okay? The people are going to be divided. Some are going to be taken into captivity. You have to realize in prophecy, especially end-time prophecy, not everything is literal, okay? And sometimes that's where the tricky part comes. Because when he says taken into captivity, that does not necessarily mean that they're physically taken like they were in Babylon. Taken into captivity can mean simply that they are deceived. Okay? So whichever way you want to look at it, at some point, a battle for the city takes place, and the people of the city are divided, at least in their belief. Okay? What you need to, and I started talking about this last week. For the last 50 years, 50 plus years, Israel as a nation has possessed the city of Jerusalem in whole, okay? And if I had more time, there could be maps or something, but you've all at least seen a map of Israel, and you know that Jerusalem is there toward the center, but very near the border, the eastern border with Jordan, okay? Israel did not always possess that area of land where the city is, okay? And you also need to understand that the city of Israel, current modern-day Israel, actually is in two parts. If you've ever heard it on the news, you ever heard anybody describe West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, or you can call it the old city, the new city, okay? And it is a sight to behold. And I've been there, and it's crazy. It literally, if you're in West Jerusalem, the new city, you might as well be walking downtown Cincinnati. I mean, it's everything is 100% modern buildings and infrastructure and all of that. And cars everywhere and subway trains and everything. I mean, you might as well be in Cincinnati, New Jersey, someplace like that. When you do get to Old Jerusalem, you take one step into the city and you have gone back in time 2,000 years. I mean, it is Old Jerusalem. And they are all one big part of the city, and it is the capital of Jerusalem, but there is a distinction made. The old city of Jerusalem is where the Temple Mount is. It is where the wall of the old city. It's where the city of David. It is where, obviously, the Muslim shrines and stuff that are there now on the Temple Mount, but ultimately where Solomon's temple stood, where the second temple stood, where the third temple will be. That's where Golgotha was, all that. That's all there in the old city, okay? That part of the city has only belonged to Israel since 1967. Prior to that, it belonged to Transjordan. Since that time, you have all heard the term occupied Palestine. You've heard it in the news, okay? And why do they say that? Because you've got this area, and it's called the West Bank. Officially, it's called Judea and Samaria. But it is this area of conflict. And it is this area where there are people who are called the Palestinians. And there is this conflict. And it is a conflict that needs resolution. And all the world leaders are trying to figure it out. And everybody would love to be the one to fix it. And you've all heard the term, never. There will never be an agreement made by both parties about what to do about Jerusalem. Because since 1967, the Jews possess the city in its entirety. It is their capital, and it is their, and I say it's their seat of religion, of the Jewish people. But we as Christians need to understand that is also the founding seat of yours and my religion. Jesus did not walk in Ohio. He walked in Israel. He didn't die here. He died there. Right there in Jerusalem. That is where it happened. Okay? And much conflict about the history of Jerusalem, and sides, and people claiming and saying there was never a Jewish temple here, and it was never a Jewish city. There has been, okay, I'll tell you a story. While we were in Jerusalem and we were looking at the Temple Mount, and to make things simple, you just need to understand that mostly the Jordanian leadership of the Islamic people have official control over the security and the goings-on of the Temple Mount, okay? And they do the best they can. So what's happening on the Temple Mount is under the control of Islamic Jordanian government, okay? And that can, at any time by the Israeli government, be revoked. And it almost was a few months ago when they were having all the problems with people bringing knives and trying to stab people, and then you guys remember on the news when they said we don't want the metal detectors. People, it's a conflict of the religion. We don't want metal detectors and all this stuff. Israel came an ace of taking back control of the security of the Temple Mount. That would have been an incredible happening. It didn't happen, but you see how close we are to major changes taking place in these very conflicted areas of Jerusalem. It could happen just as easily again. So we're looking at this, and our guide is showing us, and he's saying, you see this part of the wall that looks new? Yeah, we see it. He said that is because repairs had to be done on that section of the wall, because unbeknownst to the Israeli government, the Islamic leadership of the Temple Mount was secretly doing excavations underneath their mosque on the southern part of the to make renovations, whatever. But they were digging underneath, and they did not have permission to do so. Okay, it's very hard to get permission to dig anywhere in the old city of Jerusalem because of how much history is there. They discovered, because cracks started appearing in the wall, and they said something's going on, somebody's doing something under there. Sure enough, they go in, they find out the Islamic leadership of the Temple Mount is doing excavations. They've hauled off truckloads of dirt, and they had to put a stop to it. But because they'd already dug up this dirt and hauled it off, they said, well, it's hard to do any historical archaeological excavations here because it's so heavily controlled. But they've already dug it up, so they said, where'd you dump the dirt? They showed them, we dumped it outside of town over here. And so some groups went and got a hold of that dirt and started going through it. And just in the last several years, they have discovered coins, pottery, all kinds of things with reference to, with ancient Hebraic inscriptions with reference to the Temple of Solomon and the Second Temple. Okay? There is an enormous amount of archaeological evidence. Forget, I've got faith in the Bible, and I believe, I understand all that. But in the community of practical science, they want hard evidence. It's there. The evidence is there. A temple stood there since 1000 BC, built by Solomon, destroyed in 587 BC, rebuilt by Zerubbabel, destroyed again in 70 AD by the 10th Roman Legion. It's all of the evidence is there. And it shows the Jews in control of Jerusalem with their temple in the city worshiping. There has never been a piece of pottery or coin or tablet or scrap of paper or a thing found by any archaeological community in Israel that shows a mosque or a shrine since the time of the founding of Islam, 627 AD. Obviously prior, it wouldn't be prior to that, but there is nothing that shows a predating of worship other than the Hebrew worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at their temple in Jerusalem. Okay? So the scripture says it. History backs it up. Solid evidence proves it. What more do you want? See what I'm saying? So that is the hard facts that the world is faced with. But you all know as well as I do, we have to be politically correct. Right? We've got to be politically correct. So things are still the way they are. But God is talking about this whole thing's going to come to a head, and at some point, the city is going to become the absolute focus of conflict, and at some point, major division will take place. Okay? Verse 3, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move to the north and half to the south. Okay, for this part, I got to tie you back into Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38 talks about a battle that's going to happen not in Jerusalem, but it's going to happen north in what is called Bashan. You know it as the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights, which borders Syria, which right now has a civil war being fought, which will eventually come to an end. And the Lebanese and Iranian fighters of that civil war at that time will turn their focus on Israel. That's when the battle will happen in the Golan Heights. Okay? God describes in Ezekiel 38 that as that battle is happening, God brings supernatural force against all of the enemies that come against Israel. I believe that Zechariah chapter 14 happens at the same time as the battle, we call it Gog and Magog. Ezekiel 38 is a battle taking place up in the north, in the Bashan, the Golan Heights. God is going to supernaturally affect that war. If you go to Zechariah 14 and understand these events more than likely are happening at the same time, you see evidence of what God is going to use supernaturally to affect this war. He just said that and in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is a stone's throw from the Temple Mount. Okay? If you've ever seen really beautiful pictures of the Temple Mount, just beautiful, you see the whole thing right there? It was probably taken from the Mount of Olives. It's right there. Okay? I mean, if you can stand on the Mount of Olives, and if you're standing here on the Mount of Olives, get to the railroad tracks, that's the Temple Mount. And there's a valley between, okay? And that valley is called the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley runs south down past the old city of David and runs there. And then the valley, it's not real prominent, but the entire valley runs continually all the way down to the Dead Sea, following the Jordan River, or running right alongside the Jordan River, going all the way down to the Dead Sea. Okay? He says that he will place his feet and stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. If you had to practically or scientifically explain what could be happening here, what are some of the first things that come to mind? Major earthquake. Okay? And I believe this is happening at the same time of the Battle of Gog and Magog. Ezekiel 38. All of these enemies that I believe come from Syria, the Lebanese army, the Iranian army, possibly joined by Russian forces who are fighting in Syria currently. And we've all looked through Zechariah. There's weapons that have been prepared for this. And if you read in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that battle which takes place is going to have extreme weapons used. How do I know? Because at the end of that battle, no one is able to go into the Bashan, the Golan Heights, for 7 years because of the weapons that were used. That's what it says in Ezekiel 38. So we're either talking about terrible chemical weapons or something of the nature of nuclear weapons. Okay? Something is going to be used in that battle, probably not by Israel, but I'm going to get to another point here quickly to show you the possibilities. But God is going to put a stop to this whole thing. At the same time, Zechariah 14 tells us that Jerusalem is under attack. God puts a stop to the whole thing, I believe, by sending a massive earthquake that reshapes the land. Because south of Jerusalem is a barren, dry desert, okay, called the Negev desert. Barren, dry desert. Israel's population is increasing every day because of the programs that they have to encourage Jews and non-Jews from around the world, Christians, people from around the world, to come and live in Israel. And they do. So the population is expanding every day. In the size of New Jersey, half of their country cannot be lived in because, or it can, but it is inhospitable. It's desert. The southern half, until you get down to the Mediterranean, is inhospitable. It's desert. Very small and gets even smaller as it goes south. And he says he makes a large valley. Then you shall flee through my mountain of Judah. Thus saith the Lord my God will come, and all the saints with you. What's happening here is that something has shifted in the city of Jerusalem. Something has happened and something has shifted in the city of Jerusalem to the point, you remember that 1/3 that God said will flourish with fish and greenery. But with this earthquake, I believe, God shifts the geography of the land, opens up a valley which allows people, the Dead Sea and the south, the Negev, and now the people have to know. Teachers believe that it's talking about there's no lights in the city. Electricity has been knocked out. Okay? And somebody made a really interesting point to me one time, because I don't fully, agree with everything that some people say, but it was a very interesting point. And he said, I believe that in the battles of the last days, power grids will be knocked out, electrical components will no longer work. That's a result of EMP or whatever, or nuclear blast would take out all of these things, and now nothing works anymore. He said that sure would explain why every battle we read about in Revelation is fought on horseback. I was like, that's a pretty good point. I don't know. I don't know that from another. It could be, it couldn't be. But he's saying in that day, only God will know if it's light or dark. The people on the ground won't know. That's weird. Something has happened, and people can no longer tell if it's day or night. And I'll just let your imagination fill in the blanks. What has happened. I can't say for sure, but I can tell you this scripture is saying that at that time, they won't know if it's daytime, nighttime, they won't know a thing. But he's talking about that evening time it shall happen that it will be light. Verse 8, and in that day it shall be that living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and half of them toward the western sea. In both summer and winter it shall occur. And the Lord shall be king over all the earth, and in that day it shall be the Lord is one, and his name is one. Okay? So, obviously, 8 and 9, it's talking about how all of this is going to end. Okay? Now he's filling in more details. Verse 10. All the land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. Jerusalem shall be raised up and inhabited in her place from Benjamin's gate to the place of the first gate and the corner gate, from the tower of Hanel to the king's winepress. The people shall dwell in it, and no longer shall there be utter destruction, but Jerusalem shall be safely inhabited. Okay? So he's talking about how this is all going to end. And we're saying, boy, he's skipping a whole lot of stuff. Yes, he did. Daniel did the same thing. If you go back to Daniel and look at Daniel prophesying about the end times, there's one part where Daniel went to write something down and God said, don't write it because it's not for people to know yet. These prophets were not shown everything. They didn't have all the details. It wasn't until John on the island of Patmos that God said it's time to give out more details. And there's still details we don't have. But you do understand Zechariah was not privy to all the information that John had on Patmos. He didn't know about the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, the harlot of Babylon. He didn't know about the dragon. He didn't know about the beast, the mark. He didn't know about all this stuff. He didn't have those details. But John doesn't give the details of what's happening on the ground like Zechariah is. So you have to take things and fill in the blank. You have to understand that this is happening at the same time as that and all this kind of stuff. So verse 12, he's going to give us some more details of what's happening on the ground. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who fought against Jerusalem. This is where it gets interesting. Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets, and their tongues shall dissolve in their mouth. It shall come in that day that a great panic from the Lord will be among them. Everyone will seize the hand of his neighbor and raise his hand against his neighbor's hand. Judah also will fight at Jerusalem. And the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be gathered together, gold, silver, and apparel in great abundance. Such also shall be the plague on the horse and the mule, on the camel and the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in those camps. So shall this plague be. If you go to Revelation, and you'll start noticing that in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth trumpet blasts that are being given, shofar blasts from angels in the heavens, you'll see 1/3 of the earth, man die, 1/3 of the animals dies. You know, all these things are taking place. So no one's giving a complete and total picture of how it's happening. But when I put things together and I realize that great battles are taking place in the north, in the city of Jerusalem, great conflict to the point of big weapons being used. You've heard for the last 2 or 3 years that the United States is, they are now, drastically opposed to the nation of Iran having any sort of ability to develop nuclear technology. Okay? Now, 10 years ago, when I began teaching prophecy, things were pretty easy to teach when concerning Iran, because they're of a fella that sure made teaching on prophecy a lot easier. His name was Ahmadinejad. He was the leader of Iran at the time, and he was nuts. He thought that he was what they call the 12th Imam, the awaited one in the Muslim teaching, basically their equivalent of a Messiah, and he believed that he was that one. He believed he was. He was crazy, and most prophecy teachers thought this is the guy. This is the guy. He's the one going to make it all happen. Well, his term ran up and he went out, and a much more conservative moderate was put in his place. A leader of the people of Iran by the name of Rouhani. And we're much happier with him. He's conservative, he's moderate. However, he rose to power in the Iranian government by leading the I don't even know what you call it within their government structure, but leading the major division of their government. And that major division that he led was the division of nuclear advancement. He was head of the nuclear program in Iran for more than 20 years. Rouhani was. Now he's their leader. Okay? It is no accident that as soon as he came to power after a few years, all of a sudden they want to make deals with, and you just have to you have to forgive me, I don't care how you voted one way or another. Iran was looking for weak Western leaders who would agree to this plan, and he found them. He found them in Europe. He found them in our country. He found people who were more concerned with making everybody politically correct and happy. He found weak leadership to enter into a nuclear agreement that looked like it was preventing weapons from being developed. This Iranian nuclear agreement that y'all heard so much about, and that our current president has pulled us out of, under much criticism, and anybody will, I don't care what news channel it is, they'll tell you all the repercussions of us being pulled out of there. What they will not tell you is that Iran did not stick up to any part of their deal at all. They were supposed to stop producing uranium. They didn't. They were supposed to stop their intercontinental ballistic missile program. They didn't. They were supposed to stop sending weapons to terrorist organizations. They didn't. They didn't keep up any part of their bargain at all. So we pulled out of the deal. We said no. Of course, it's a little too late on that, what are 200, 300 billion we sent them. You know, a little too late to get that back. But we pulled out of the deal. So Iran, as it stands right now, is back under watch. We don't want you developing your nuclear program. Okay? So the people who are most against Iran having a nuclear program are democratic nations that surround them. Obviously, we don't want you developing nuclear missiles. You produce leaders who think that they are Islamic gods and messiahs and ought to wipe out Christian and Jewish nations. We don't want you having a nuclear program. And that's sensible, right? I mean, I would think so. You're talking about countries that have produced leaders that has said things to the extent of, if I have my way, Israel will be underwater. Just last week, an Iranian general said, he said it on social media, he said it for all the world to hear. He said, Netanyahu had better learn how to swim. That's why he said this. He said this openly to the world. Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of Israel, prime minister of Israel, he said, Netanyahu better learn how to swim because I'm blowing him to the Mediterranean. He just said this. That's why we don't want them to have a nuclear program. However, they have already shown that they're unwilling to stop their nuclear program. It's untelling what technology they might have. Okay? We already know that shipments to Lebanon and Syria containing large weapons on rockets and missiles have been stopped. And you don't hear this stuff because, I mean, if you're talking about the CIA or the IDF, you never hear about anything that they do. However, you have these watchdog groups and intelligence agencies from other countries, and they leak stuff, and there's been stories that have come out about container ships containing missiles, containing large weapons on their way to Syria. Where'd they come from? They came from Iran. Russian flags on the side of some of those. Okay? It's crazy, the trail that leads back to the puppetry that has taken place of the militaries all around Israel, especially the civil war in Syria is a huge hotbed for all these. You know, Russia's involved. The United States is involved. European. Why? Because they can use this war to operate their puppets. You know, and all this stuff. So, who knows who's behind the stuff that's happening? But at some point, I believe some type of weaponry, such as nuclear weaponry, is used, either in that northern area of Bashan, the Golan Heights, where it says in Ezekiel 38, they can no longer enter that land for 7 years, because of the weapons that are used. Then it says that they take the weapons that were not used and use them for fuel for over 7 years. You know, so you see there's something to these weapons. These aren't just black powder bombs, you know. Then he's talking about in verse 12 that a plague is going to come upon people in this area. What is the plague? Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets, and their tongues shall dissolve in their mouth. I mean, that's crazy. He's talking about this as a plague upon the people. So, one of the things I've always wondered about is, if this is enemies using some type of nuclear weapon against Israel, well, that would not be a plague that God has sent, even though God is in control of all these things that's happening. God is not sending enemies against Israel, though. And then somebody showed me something really interesting, and I'm talking, this has been 3 or 4 years ago. And all I can say, I can't even say who this is, but it's a friend of mine, and I was allowed to get this information. He didn't give it to me not being allowed to do it, but he has privy to this information. At the time, I was allowed to hear this information, so I have it. I'm going to give it to you, okay? Yeah. And this is not because, and this is, I can tell you, this information did not come from American or Israeli intelligence. It actually came from Japanese intelligence. Okay, that's usually where a lot of people get, believe it or not, in the world of espionage, that's where a lot of people get their information. Japanese intelligence. Because they just let everything out. Okay, I don't know why, but you know, you won't hear anything from the CIA, the IDF, you won't hear. But if the Japanese find out, it's going to be on the news. Okay, they just let it all out. A story that took place, and I believe it was around 2005, when the Gaza conflict started. And the story goes something like this. At that time, there was terrorist organizations that were a Israeli school bus that had been hijacked, not with kids on it or anything, but they stole the bus. And there was at least 20, maybe 25 terrorists on there with weapons, don't even know what they had or anything. But they were driving north out of Gaza. Now, if you go out of Gaza and go north, you will get to the city of Tel Aviv, which is a huge city. We don't know why they were going there, but they were headed there. More than 20 plus terrorists loaded with weapons. Okay? All we know is that the Israeli Defense Force issued a warning and closed off all of the roads leading south out of Tel Aviv and north out of the southern cities around Gaza. They shut the road down completely, okay, for a couple of hours. Things happened, and the road was opened back up. They went to the road and found the school bus. When they found the school bus was intact. It was fine. It was damaged at some point, but I mean not blown to bits. But every single human on that school bus was nothing but a skeleton. No clothes, no hair, no guns, no skin, skeletons. Burnt skeletons. Okay? That's weird. But it happened. The technology that it would take to pull that off is possible. It is a technology that very few countries claim to have ever developed. The United States is not one of them. It is a technology called neutron bomb. Okay? It's not an atomic bomb. It's not a big blast that puts a crater in the ground and all that stuff. But it vaporizes human flesh and leaves a skeleton. Verse 12 describes just that. Okay, so it's very interesting. It's kind of crazy. Then he goes on and he says that he's talking about this time of this plague that, nations around, all the surrounding nations, the wealth of all the nations is right there in Israel. Verse 16, it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. It shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague with which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. How many times have you got to mention the Feast of Tabernacles before you realize he's trying to tell you something? Okay, just keep that in mind. Verse 20. In that day, holiness to the Lord shall be engraved on the bells of the horses, the pots, and the Lord's house shall be like the bowls before the altar. Yes, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness to the Lord of hosts. Everyone who sacrifices shall come and take them and cook in them. In that day shall no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts. He's talking about a time when you go physically to the city of Jerusalem to worship the King who is there. Who is the King, the Lord of hosts? Jesus Christ. He's talking about there's coming a time when people will come to Jerusalem, not anywhere else. They'll come to Jerusalem. Why? Because the King is there. And he mentions the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles is the last feast of the 7. It is symbolic of the last of the events. Okay? The last of the events is the 1,000-year millennial reign of Jesus Christ. During that time, the King, Jesus Christ, is on a throne in Jerusalem. Not New Jerusalem. Not this heavenly city of New Jerusalem. It hasn't come down yet. He is actually in the Jerusalem that exists now. And they will build a temple during the time of the tribulation. That temple will be built. When it's all said and done, Jesus comes to Jerusalem, goes into that temple, and sits on a throne. And if you and I are alive at that time, guess what we're all going to do? Get your car, get your boat, get your plane, get whatever you need to get. You need to get to Jerusalem because the King's there and you got to worship him. That's going to happen. And that's really cool to me. I mean, honestly, it's just really neat. The whole world, after these events and the events of tribulation, God is going to leave the world in a condition where now there is but one leadership. And there is but one leader. And he's coming down himself, Jesus Christ, to sit on a throne in Jerusalem and rule the world. Okay? That's going to happen. And I'm not here to talk about the millennial reign. That's a whole nother couple of weeks. But after that millennial reign 1,000-year period is over, that's when you have the time of judgment, the white throne judgment, those type of things. Then you have the holy city up there in heaven, holy city, New Jerusalem, descends down, and God himself places his capital on the borders of Jerusalem, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Okay? So those events are what's happening, and they're coming up. They're upon us. And if anybody was here when Randy Caldwell was here, he said something that I had never even considered. I mean, I really never had even considered. We read about the events of the book of Revelation, the 6 seals being opened, the 4 horsemen, and the martyrs, and the oppression, and the death, and the destruction. And we say, well, obviously it's not happening yet. Well, we can certainly say that in America. But he said, what do you think Christians in Syria right now would have to say. If somebody were to say to them, you think the tribulation's happening yet? There's a lot of Christians in Syria that would probably look back at you and say, you better believe it's happened. I mean, and that blows my mind to think, oh, wow. Us, Western-centric, eagle-minded Americans that think, well, it's not happening here, so the tribulation hasn't started yet. No, hold on. This Bible isn't about America. It's about Israel, and it's about that land. And you might have a different story in that area, in Lebanon, in Syria, and the Christians in that area. The time is now. He's saying in that day, and he could be talking about these days. It's entirely possible. So that's the book of Zechariah, and I know not all your questions are answered. Not all of mine are either. But it's an interesting way to tie things together and look at how things are going to come to pass. So Zechariah saw all of that stuff, and that's it. So I have 60 seconds. Does anybody have any questions about the book or anything you want to bring up or any questions you want to ask while I'm here? No?